Mariana, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to be speaking.
Thank you. I'm so happy to talk to you.
I am really excited by this book, Night Vision, it's titled. And at first I thought, oh, night vision goggles, that brings to mind some fairly scary experiences. But it's talking about, the fears that we have inside us, seeing ourselves through dark moods, learning to, relate better to ourselves through actually not being afraid of what's inside. And I think, the sort of first thing I really want to emphasize is that although this is talking about darker sides of the human experience, it's not a manifesto for them. It's not trying to say, we all need to wallow in darkness, but it's saying we're not necessarily as a culture or as individuals well equipped to do the difficult work of actually being with what's there. And, this, I think, tallies very well with some of the themes of yoga philosophy, although the yoga world has got a bit lost down the same rabbit hole with its fixation on love and light, some of which does come from ancient texts. The Upanishads talk about being led from darkness to light as the path to, liberation. But a lot of it seems to come from, modern Western sources that are some of the ones you talk about in your book. So I wonder if we could just start by talking in general about this metaphor of light, why it became so pervasive, and how that starts to become a problem.
Yeah, thank you. You've said so much. It's wonderful. I wanted to hone in on your word ill-equipped, or we're not well equipped. And I think that's a really nice way to say it. We're not always really good at dealing with the dark moods. Like we haven't been taught well. It's not our own fault. Like we haven't been taught, and we've been taught so much about going toward love and light. And like we sort of know we're supposed to do joy and happiness and lightness and fun and everything. But when it comes to the dark ones, we've been told all this advice to either ignore it, push it away, suppress it, get rid of it in some way. I'm a philosopher, and so for me, I was sort of digging into the sources of this dichotomy between, this kind of poverty or anemia when it comes to dark moods, and then we're just pummeled with the light. And this is where I think that it depends on your own personal experience for all of your listeners. Like my world doesn't necessarily describe everyone's world, but there are a lot of people who say that they live in the world that I live in. So first, I'm in the US, right? So I don't know how it is where everyone lives in their own country, in their own society. But where I am, I'm in South Texas. I've been here for 15 years. But I think that sort of Target is Target. And when you go into Target, there's just, at least when I was doing it, 2014, 15, 16, and I don't know how it is now, but the signs were all about choose happy, good vibes only, no bad days, love and light, blessed, right? All of these signs that we put up in our house to remind ourselves to be grateful. And we're supposed to keep gratitude journals, and we're supposed to choose happy, and we're supposed to be radiant and glow and have light bulb moments. Like there's so much emphasis on light as itself a metaphor that in the book, I'm just calling them all the light metaphor. And it's like, go toward what's light, go away from what's dark. And that is wonderful. Like, so for me, that gets sort of shorthand for that is when people say like hashtag choose happy. Like that's the one that I kind of hang on to as a representative of a lot of that. And it's beautiful when you're happy. Like when you're in a good mood, when the sun is shining, or you go outside, you're happy, you're having a good day, you can get the impression that you've done it yourself, right? You've changed your attitude, you've fixed your face, you've made yourself like ready for the day, you've invited the good vibes in, etc., right? Like it all feels good, and it feels like it's quite tempting to think that we have caused it ourselves. And so we don't notice like the underbelly. But what I'm worried about is on the bad day. I'm worried about what do we say to ourselves, and what does society say to us when we're not having a good day? And I pick on Rachel Hollis but she was brave enough. So I pick on the self-help industry in general because it all has this same messaging, or most of it has this same messaging of what she says, like if like I became happy and you can too, right? I stopped doing that stuff, and all these like titles with the profanities in them. Like, I
Yes.
did it to myself. I got myself unstuck. I did this. I did that. I got into this place. And you can too. But Rachel Hollis is the only one honest enough. And she said it outright. She wrote, if you're not happy, then it's on you. And then I think, oh, there it is. There's the catch, right? So the nice self-help authors, they sound great when it's like, you can get out of your misery, you can lead a happy life. But the undertone of that is that if I choose happy, like if that is the philosophy that I live by, that I choose my mood and my happiness and my like lifelong moods, then that means that if I am not happy, then I have also chosen that. And that's where it really burns. And that's where shame comes in. And that's where people feel terrible about themselves, right? So the 5 moods that I write about in the book are anger, sadness, grief, anxiety, and depression. And these are prime for either you to say to yourself, well, then I'm messed up. I must be broken because I didn't choose happy. I'm a hot mess. I am deficient. I'm mentally ill. There's something wrong with me. That is what I'm calling the brokenness story. And it's just on the other side. It's like 2 sides of a coin. It's on the underside of the light metaphor. The light metaphor says everything light is wonderful. And the brokenness story says, and if you're not happy, it's on you.
Hmm. Thank you. There's a lot to unpack there, and I think that's going to keep us busy for the next few minutes. Just starting at the beginning, though, I think you explain very clearly how there's a sort of fusion of 2 strands of thought creating this problem. And one of them goes right back to the roots of Western philosophy in some ways, and is a recurring theme. And the other is actually, a relatively recent American phenomenon, all about, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and the American dream is yours. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that intellectual history, just to give us some context.
Yes. So the ancient Stoics, the Greek and Roman ancient Stoics, and it's funny and not funny that Stoicism is again popular today because it just went out like all the other ancient philosophies, not practiced for a long time. But it's back, and it on the one hand is quite realistic. It basically says you can't control what's outside of yourself. You can only control what's inside of yourself. And so they have this, it's called the dichotomy of control, where you're supposed to sort of look at your day and look at your life and look at everything about you and figure out what's worth spending my time on. And so they believe that we can actually suppress our negative emotions, or just not even suppress them, because suppress them sort of indicates that they've already come up, but like never allow them to be. We can just avoid them because they make us miserable. Like, why would we do that? And the way that they do this is by equating judgments with feelings with thoughts. So if you have a thought about something, that's the same as your feeling. You're assenting to it, is what they would say. And you just don't have to assent to your anger. Why would you ever let yourself get angry? And so, like, if you're listening, if you're a person who has ever said to somebody else, I'm really sorry I got angry, that's a Stoic thought, even if you don't know it.
Hmm.
It's a Stoic way of thinking, to think, I should have stopped that. What's wrong with me? I didn't stop it from happening. And in today's day and age, we also have a competing philosophy of emotion, which is just, okay, I have that feeling, but I shouldn't act on it, or I should do something with it, or I should punch a pillow, or I should do something else. And I equate that more with Aristotle's way of thinking. Aristotle thought, okay, feelings are fine, feelings are harmless. You don't need to stop your feelings from happening, but you need to control your behavior. You need to control your reactions. You need to not flip off the person who has just cut you off in traffic. You need to be in full control of yourself. So for me, that's the difference between Aristotle and the Stoics. But going back to what you were referring to, what I think is going on, at least in the US, is a mix between the Stoicism that says, I can be happy if I want to. Like, my happiness is 100% in my control. But then there's Norman Vincent Peale, who came around in 1950s, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking, who also started the strand of thought that leads to today what is manifestation, which is I can actually change my physical world, which the Stoics would never say. They would say, no, you control yourself. Like, you control the insides. You don't attempt to stake all your happiness on whether you get a promotion or married or whether the wind blows your way. Like they say, go inward, and that's where your happiness is. But Norman Vincent Peale and other sort of positive thinkers are like, you can actually make it happen in the world. You can fix the physical world to conform to you if you have the positive thoughts. And so for me, that's like a terrible combination, because then what happens is when everything's going well, you think you've manifested that, you think you've done it. And then when it goes badly, you think you're broken, you think you don't work right, you think there's something wrong with you. Meanwhile, that was never really the way that life was. You've just mixed two philosophies that actually don't go together. Like the Stoics would never say that we can manifest our dreams in the outside world. They would say, no, that's actually a foolish endeavor. We ought to be um, fixing ourselves to not need those dreams, to not want that kind of like um, reaction from the world or praise or anything like that. Like we have to work on our own selves. So we're in a mess, I think, in the US because well, I mean, it's not even ourselves. Like this is not a book like condemning the self. This is really like society. Like this is posters in my airport that say, there's a picture of a tunnel and it says it will get brighter. And then you look at who's putting it out and it just says optimism, pass it on. These are just messages from our society that we're supposed to feel this way. These are the expectations. And if you're not like this, then something's wrong with you. Then you must be broken and you must need to be fixed by more other parts of society.
Yeah, and you point out some rather insidious tendencies there within the self-help industry. And obviously there's a plethora of people you can pay money either for just advice in book form or all manner of coaching to try and get better at manifesting your dreams. And the hidden message is always, if they don't come true, you haven't tried hard enough, or something in you isn't working properly, and you either need to go away and crawl into a hole or double down with the advanced course. And
Yeah.
there's
If I could just jump in, like
yeah.
I come to this as a lover of self-help. I love self-help. I go to it. And here's the trick, like you go to it when you're suffering, right? Something's wrong. And so you go to the book that says get rid of your anxiety or, raise your kids better or something. And you go with the feeling like I must be doing something wrong. And then it's like an exercise in self-flagellation, because it really is like, oh yeah, it was me. That's right. I am doing something wrong. You go and they give you homework and they're like, you're doing it wrong. This is why your kid is messed up. This is why your life is messed up. And this is what you have to do. And then they give you homework. So it's like this crazy attraction that I have toward a thing, like a moth to the light, where I go and then it hurts me more to read that stuff, because then I'm confirmed that it is in fact all my fault and that I have to do X, Y, and Z to get out of it. And then probably I won't. So then I'm going to end up in another self-help book. So it's just this kind of insidious cycle, but I joke or I laugh about it because it is still quite attractive to me.
And you come up with a very intriguing analogy that helps to make sense of this, which I hadn't really thought about for 30 years since I was an undergraduate, going back to Plato and his cave, and not just focusing on the people looking at the shadows on the wall, which is the only bit I really remember, but the fact that there's some other characters there who are making the shadows appear, and they perhaps have some connection to some of these people we've just been talking about. They are the sort of engineers of the cultural milieu in which we swim.
Yeah, I had never heard people refer as much to the puppeteers as I do, and I couldn't believe it. Like I was looking for it. So in the cave story of Plato, which is one of the most famous stories in philosophy, all these people are prisoners. They're all looking ahead. They're all shackled at the neck and the feet. They can only sort of hear each other. They have these contests. They all see shadows on the wall. There's objects behind them who are projecting, but they can't see that there's objects. They only see the shadow. And so they believe that shadows are the real thing. So they live their whole life thinking the shadow's the thing. And then one of them gets released by force, like he did not want to be released, got dragged to turn around, and then saw the actual puppets that were causing the shadows and was thoroughly confused. And then, because there was like a little fire in the cave to make that all happen. And then he got dragged out of the cave into the light, which of course hurt him like crazy. So for months, or however you want to imagine it, he's sort of blinded and he's just mad. And the only thing he likes is when it's night. And he also likes to look at the water when there's like shadows on the water. So he understands shadows on the ground, he understands the water, but slowly, 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 he accustoms to the light and then realizes that everything he believed before was wrong. So the shadows were not the real thing, they were just shadows of puppets of the real thing. Because imagine if the puppet was a tree, right? The puppet's not even an actual tree, it's just the puppet of a tree. And then he's believing that the shadow of a tree is an actual tree. He's been calling that thing tree his whole life. So eventually the story goes, by the light of the sun and by the light of truth, like lots of philosophers weigh in on this, that's how we come to know what's real. And I just kept being suspicious about like who's casting the shadows. And we're told that there's just some puppeteers in there, who are holding behind a little wall so that the people can't see them. They're holding up the puppets so that they cast the shadows. And I'm like, who's doing that? I always ask my classes, like, do you think that those people are also prisoners? Like, do they choose to be there? Do they get to go home at the end of the day? Plato gives us nothing on that. But I'm fascinated with these, and I think they're underanalyzed. So for me, the problem was always posed as the light is good, the dark is ignorance. Light is enlightenment and rationality and all the good things in life, intelligence, etc., like light bulb moment and all the things that I've already said. And then dark is ignorant, dark is ugly, dark is backwards, dark is primitive, dark is dangerous. And I point out in the book, obviously, this has had a terrible effect on the world's perception of light and dark skin and the way that people are treated, the way that people are feared, etc., based on this kind of story about light and dark. And so I want to just say I don't think it's about the light and the dark. I don't think that our point is to go from ignorance in a cave to the outside world of rationality. I think it's more like, is there any way to get out of where there's puppeteers? Can we kick them out? Or can we at least identify them? Can we look at them? Can we figure out who is trying to get us to believe that we're broken when we are suffering, when we're just sad, that we're a hot mess, or that we should feel ashamed of our dark mood and that we should try to get rid of it as soon as possible? Like, who is giving us that messaging? That's more like what I'm after. So it's a societal view and a societal critique rather than any sort of individual critique of any one person. You know, it's not like what to say when you talk to yourself. It's more like, what is the world saying about our dark moods that makes us feel so terrible about them? And is there any way that we can sort of change our societal perception of anxiety, depression, grief, such that we all become more literate to be able to talk to each other during these moods and not have to sort of isolate or hide from people or other sort of tactics to deal with these moods?
Thank you. Yeah. And that is a very rich terrain to start exploring. And I'd like to come back to this question of the social in relation to the individual a little bit later. But first, I'd like to just zero in on what we do with all of this in terms of light and dark, because you say very clearly at the start of the book that the problem has been that you shine light on darkness to get rid of the problem and move towards all the good stuff, then it all looks quite bleak. The brighter the light, the more stark it all appears. And instead of doing that, we should find a way to actually see in the dark, to be in the dark, and not try and get rid of darkness with the introduction of light, but not necessarily get stuck in the dark either, because there are unpleasant aspects to dark moods, but only by actually being with them can we learn something about the experience. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what it means to be in the dark and to learn to see in the dark.
Yeah. So each chapter is trying to figure that out. So I can just take anger as
Hmm.
an example. And I think it's worth saying that this is individual, right? Like a person's willingness to stay in the dark of their mood, a person's desire to, a person's upbringing, right? Like it all comes down to an individual choice. But I do think a whole lot of people would benefit from society letting us take that chance and not trying to cheer us up, right? Like I think that's the problem, is that once we announce that we're depressed or anxious or something, there's a kind of, sometimes there can be like a panic or a denial. I witness a lot of denial from my students, from their parents. What do you mean? What do you have to be depressed about? What are you talking about? You know, like you're just sad, just get out of bed, right? So there's either this kind of denial slash forcing it not to be, or there's a kind of, I'm just going to leave you alone, like ghosting. Grievers get ghosted all the time because the people around them are so inept and don't understand what to do and say and get so nervous. And we've not been taught this stuff, right? It's not our own fault that we're sort of illiterate, but we, I think, need to learn to understand, like, how do we get to empathy? How do we get to sympathy? It's not by trying to cheer a person up, right? I think we have that stuck in our mind. Like if someone's low, down, then we should bring them up. If someone's dark, we should shine a flashlight on them. If someone's upset, we should make them laugh or take them dancing. And I think that so much of that is coming from ancient philosophy, a different philosophy called Epicureanism, which is just, it just pits the opposite emotions. Like everything is opposites, and our goal in life is to minimize suffering and maximize pleasure. And I think that that goes wrong in that we are creatures who suffer. And so denying that and trying to get out of it or trying to act like we're not creatures who suffer is only going to cause us more suffering. And so I'll take anger as an example. So I am a very, like, I don't know, genetically angry person. My father was a very angry person. And for me, it's like the go-to, like, bad emotion. I wish I could cry. I would do anything to cry when I'm mad or upset. Like sometimes I pretend I'm crying because people like crying better. Like people respond better than if you're just sort of angry and shouting at them. So when I'm angry, if I go to my sources, which is philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, there's some version of either, like I was saying before, you shouldn't feel this way. You should be more in control of your emotions. You're weak. You have a problem. You're too emotional. You're too sensitive, right? And that has so many resonances in our current society. Why do you let things get to you? You shouldn't let anyone under your skin, etc. Right? So then you just get sort of like slapped for it. Like you shouldn't be angry. That's your problem. Or, and then you do that to yourself, right? It becomes internalized. I look in the mirror and like Plato said that like angry people are like dark horses and they're like run amok, and my hair is like wild and I'm just like, yeah, I'm ugly, right? This is a very ugly, not to mention all the gendered aspects of it, right? Unladylike anger, like it's just so loaded that my likelihood of feeling like garbage when I'm angry is very high, right? So I would just look in the mirror after I would yell at my kids or be angry, and I would look in the mirror and be like, okay, you are a monster. That's it. That's the only explanation. You were raised in a barn and you're a monster, and who's ever going to love you? And so I thought, okay, these sources don't seem to be helping me, right? These sources are pitting me against myself, and they're not letting me sit in the dark, like, because literally, like, I'm just shoving it away. I'm just saying, you shouldn't be angry. Like, if you reprimand yourself for your emotion, then you're not even able to sit with it, right? So I just was saying, if I'm angry, that means I'm bad. So I have to not be angry to be like a good mom. So then I went and I started reading other sources who I had read before, who had influenced me before, but who I hadn't seen particularly in this way. And that's Maria Lugones, a philosopher from Argentina, and Audre Lorde, beautiful philosopher poet, and Bell Hooks. And I just read them, and they were saying different things, not like anger makes you weak, anger makes you ugly, anger means you can't control yourself. They were saying, hey, you know what? I think anger is information. You should listen to it. Anger can be a tool for change. Anger is sometimes can be a kind of self-protective move, right? Anger as self-care. So then I was like, whoa, this is crazy. Like I knew there was a different way to see anger, but it involves staying angry. And I think a lot of the times what we're trying to do is like get rid of it, right? Breathe, breathe. 10 to 1 or punch a punching bag. And then I think, oh, but then we're just getting rid of it. We're not actually dealing with it. We're not listening to it. We're not trying to understand what it's trying to tell us. And so those philosophers for me help me take my own side. And I think that's the difference about listening to the dark moods or sitting in the dark moods, because it allows me to not just have a knee-jerk reaction of, oh, that's bad, but okay, let me be here. Let me see what it's about. And maybe maybe it's trying to tell me something about my world that I can actually change. Maybe I'm not the problem. Like as soon as like, I just think about like, if you wanted to create a society that was sexist, that would never change, you'd make women feel bad about getting angry. Because then there's no revolt, right? Then there's just shame. Then there's just self-policing, because then they'll never get angry. They'll never do anything different. They'll never rebel because you've already taught them that it's ugly to get angry. And so I just think, okay, we have to like rewrite the script. I think it's time to like update our education or our philosophies on these dark moods to be able to understand what can keep me on my own side? What can make me feel like I don't have to turn against myself and call myself a monster when I'm angry or when I'm sad or these other moods? Just a way to keep ourselves on our own side.
Although I'd like to come back to the example you gave there initially of shouting at your kids, and you write about this in the book, talking about frustrations during the lockdown era of COVID-19, and having to homeschool and at the same time manage your own life, and just feeling overwhelmed, and frustrations spilling out in anger. That on closer inspection were actually about the pressures that you were carrying, and taught you in a way something about how to rebalance things, and perhaps to express the need for your partner to take on some more responsibility, and perhaps also to put less pressure on yourself. So there were all sorts of, as you say, informational inputs to come out of that. But I can't help but come back to Aristotle here a little bit, and also think about some of the ideas from yogic and Buddhist traditions, and wondering whether there's a way to get more skillful with dealing with these emotions, and not trying to deny them, learning from them, but then trying to find the most effective possible way of expressing them, once we've tuned in to what the information is.
Yeah. So I think that what we're in maybe as a society, or like at least what the Stoics would have us be in, and certain philosophies today, that when you do say something like, I'm sorry, I got angry, is like a zero tolerance, is that
Mm,
it's just bad, right? There's no positive outcome, or there's no other way to look at it than as weakness and bad. And that's all I'm trying to change. I'm trying to move more toward neutral. Like, can we
mm,
just be neutral about it? And this one, and especially anxiety, which are sort of the bookends of the book, can we, instead of approaching with a knee jerk, hey, that's bad, you're a monster, can we just be like, oh, that's interesting, something's happening to me? So what I don't want to say is that now anger is virtuous, going back to
mm,
Aristotle. Like any display of anger, just do whatever you want. And in my book I talk about how I threw almonds at my kids because they couldn't disperse them fairly, so I just threw a handful at each, and now we laugh about it, right? I don't think that was right behavior, right? So I'm with
mm,
Aristotle. I don't think that was like a good and effective way. But I also think that if we can be neutral about the anger, the feeling of anger, the mood of anger, then maybe it wouldn't have to escalate to that, right? So I'm not,
mm,
I think like I'm the most sympathetic to Aristotle, like in the book, in terms of the ancients. Like I really, really love Aristotle, and I also love the Stoics, but they're more dangerous. Like I think of these philosophers now as like, who's dangerous for me to approach, who makes me feel like garbage, and who makes me feel better about myself. So Aristotle was working a lot when the kids were tiny, and then somehow in the pandemic it just wasn't helping anymore. It was making me feel judged. It was making me feel like I have to be on perfect behavior all the time. And I feel like today, in today's society, we're a little bit more about neutrality. Like I hear this in some Buddhist circles, like let's just let it in, let's be neutral, let's see what it has to say. So
mm.
I feel like I neither want to count it immediately unvirtuous, nor do I want to count it immediately virtuous. I want to say, hold on, let's think about it. And we do have to, I think, in a sense, um, separate feeling from action, but I also think there's angry actions that can be virtuous. They're not always. And this is where Maria Lugones helps me think, because she gives so many different types of anger. I think we're very general when we just say I'm angry. It's too much. I think if we can get more fine-grained, like what is exactly the anger, if we could develop a better vocabulary, I think that would help us. And then develop a different, I don't know, like I know Lee McBride is a philosopher who's working on like a new set of virtues, like in the Aristotelian spirit, but some of these include things that aren't typically virtues, like tenacity, right? Like things that are actually good and they produce change, but they might look harmful on the outset, or they certainly run countercultural to what we've been taught about how you should sort of get along with everyone, like stubbornness, right? Like obstinacy. There's something about these that if we approach them neutrally, we can play with them then and say, well, in this context, that's good. In this other context, it probably wasn't a good choice to make. So I think I'm not as like cut and dry. Like I'm not trying to say like the dark mood is the new light mood, or that anger is the new peace. Like I want to hold it all open and just kind of like I'm worried more about the self than the mood. I don't need to rehabituate a mood. I just want us to feel good about ourselves. I want society to talk better about us. I want us to feel um I don't know, like more that less broken. I really would love it if no one ever said again, I am broken, because I just don't think a human being can be broken, but that's the way we're made to feel when all the signs around us say that we're supposed to have zero bad days and only good vibes. Like the standards for me, and this is why the word toxic positivity was created. The standard is so high, like it's literally like all or nothing. So then if you're on the angle of suffering, if you're on the end of suffering, then you have nowhere to go but to call yourself a piece of garbage. And that really is pretty terrible for us.
You make that point very clear, I think, in the chapter on anxiety, where you sort of bring in some of your existentialist kind of credentials and illustrate in a very similar way, I think, to some of these yogic and Buddhist philosophies that really the world is set up to make us suffer, and the way we relate to it only compounds that suffering. And it's a lot more realistic to accept that, feeling these things is part of being a human being. And that if we're actually really honest, life's terrifying, it ends in death. And in the meantime, we've got to make some meaning out of it. And, that is on us unless we, outsource it to some sort of cosmic sky fairy. So it gets pretty complicated. And, most people are running a mile from that and pretending it's not happening. So underneath the surface, actually, of all these swans pretending to have no bad days, are these legs beavering around, desperately trying to keep the show on the road. And, so I think that is quite a helpful way to remind us to come back to, the fact that reality is challenging. Um, but I think then there's also this question of, what do we actually do about it in the immediate moment? Because a lot of this is not within our power to immediately change. The social messaging, the sort of underlying tendency to shame us, and it does seem to me that shame is the real root of the problem that sort of cuts across all of the different examples you give. It's compounding a difficult feeling by feeling that we shouldn't feel that way, and getting this reinforcement from society that this is unacceptable and actually you're a bad person, and that obviously makes you feel worse. I mean, it's an addictive way of thinking coming from outside rather than inside. And yet, on the other hand, do we not have some agency in relation to that, so that even if the outside world doesn't change its messaging, that something like a stoic mentality could say, well, we just don't need to pay attention to that. So in some ways, we need to educate ourselves about unhelpfulness of social messaging rather than expecting to have the power to change everybody's way of talking about these things.
Yeah, I think that stoicism, like for me, I just used it the other day for like a one-off instance, right? I knew I was going to be disappointed by something. So I thought, okay, let me go back to the Stoics and prepare for that. They're big on preparation. Okay, I'm going to walk out. The thing that I want there is not going to be there. How am I going to do? And it works. Like it does work to protect you from things like disappointment and sadness and anger but it takes a lot of like work. So I think it can be used. Like I don't think we have to throw everything out wholesale. I think it can be used, especially when it comes to um sharing with other people. Like other
Hmm.
people can make things worse for us if they don't understand us. Like I had a student who read my book and she was like, "Oh, great. Like I took your advice and now I'm going to tell everyone about all my suffering." And then she came back to me and she was like, oh no, it didn't work. People aren't ready to hear it. And I was thinking like, oh, you didn't get that from my book. Like, I don't mean that you should just share all your suffering with everybody because the world's not ready, precisely as you say. Like, the world's kind of emotionally anemic or illiterate. How does one go about making a world literate in something? And I think that's a great question. Like, I don't think I can make like society literate, but obviously my attempt is this book, right? My attempt is to say, okay, let's see it for what it is. Because before we were just blaming ourselves individually. Like, oh, I must be broken because I have anxiety. What do I have to be anxious about? I have such a great life. I have these two beautiful kids and a good income. Like, that sort of thing wasn't going anywhere. That wasn't helping. That's just like feeling bad about feeling bad. And I think that if I can locate the source of it, that it's our societal messaging, it's puppeteers, it's all the toxic positivity stuff that we're ingesting on a daily basis. It's sometimes we hang it in our own homes, like the signs that say be positive in our own homes.
Mm.
I think kind of like reinforce the negative feelings, like oddly, like we don't accept ourselves. And so then we're kind of at war with ourselves. But I think we also do the same with other people. So if you're asking, like, how do I think we can actually work on this? I do think it's like the interpersonal relationship, because we're also missing out on connections with other people. So if someone else is sad or upset and we ghost them, or we tell them that what they really need is to be taken out dancing, or what they really need, or what I did when this thing happened to me was that I needed this. Like, if we completely fail to reach them and be there with them and sit there with them in their darkness, then we're missing out. Because I think that humans just are here to suffer. This is the existentialist in me coming out. Like, I do believe that we just are nauseous a lot, in existentially nauseous and scared and sad, and like things are not rosy. And so if we can meet each other past the small talk into the real, like what's really going on in your life and in my life, and if we can become more like safe places for one another, where I'm not going to give you advice, I'm not going to tell you what you need to do, but also you're not going to tell me, and we can just be here and be silent and just maybe watch a movie together or eat a pizza together. And I'm trying to do that for my kids, right? I'm trying to just allow them to have whatever mood they have, right? Oh, you shouldn't be tired because you slept already, right? Like, that does no one any good. That never makes a person feel better. And so I think it can just begin in these very personal relationships that we have, just trying to understand that if that person is giving us that communication, they're actually having some faith in us, right? They have some faith that we're not going to botch it. And a lot of times, like I said with my student, it's misplaced faith, because
Mm.
people are well-meaning and they're trying to cheer you up, and they feel like it's on them to cheer you up. Like, it's my job to make my friend happy. And if she goes away and she's still not happy after talking to me, then I failed, and I should go buy her flowers, and I should do this and that. And we're spinning our wheels because those tactics don't work a lot. And sometimes they are infuriating. So if we can all learn our own like emotional literacy, there's lots of words for it. Susan David uses like emotional agility, but in terms of each other and recognizing the connection we can get. So if you don't mind, I'd like to tell a story about
Sure.
my son, because this happened after I wrote the book. My mom was dying actually as the book came out last year, and she was living in my house, and we were taking care of her, and she was on hospice. And it was just a lot going on, right? I was promoting a book, but my mom's dying literally next door to where I am right now. And then my son was in his room, two doors down, and he one night was just crying. And my mom was like a week out from dying. And he was crying, crying, crying. And I asked my husband, why is he crying? And it turned out that he had two birthday parties to go to the next day, and they were at the same time. So he couldn't go to both of them. So he's hysterically crying. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to shame him, right? The easiest thing in the world would be to be like, what's wrong? My mom's dying. And what are you talking? You're the most privileged kid out there. First world problems. Like, we say so many things that just cut down deep
Mm.
when a person's vulnerable. So I went in and we were in the dark, and I just rubbed his back, because there's nothing I can say, right? The situation is what it is. He's going to have to choose. Like, it's sad. So I just started rubbing his back. And then because we were in that mood or that zone, I started crying. And he like turned around and he was like, well, why are you crying? And I said, "Oh, baby, I'm crying because my mom is dying." And he's 10 years old at the time.
Mm.
And he just looked at me and he was like, "Yeah." And then he just like rubbed my back. And he didn't wipe away my tears. He didn't do any of the, "Oh, at least you had her for this long, everything's going to be okay." Like nothing. It was just two people in the dark having this beautiful connection. Him having his 10-year-old appropriate sadness, and me having my like 45-year-old appropriate sadness. Like there's room for all of us. There's room for all our sadness. And we can actually have and forge these deep connections when we say yes to a person in suffering rather than saying, "No, you shouldn't feel that way.
Mm.
I did everything I can, so you shouldn't feel that way. You don't know what I do for you," right? Like we panic, or we get scared, or we don't want the person to feel bad because we've not been taught well how to deal with it. But I think if we can teach ourselves and teach other people how to deal with us when we're sad, like, "No, I really don't need you to tell me that I should drink green tea. Like maybe you can just be here with me, and just listen to me, or not listen. Maybe we don't have to talk at all." Like I think we benefit, like the non-sufferer also benefits so much from connecting with someone who's suffering. And clearly the person who's suffering is going to benefit from us not ghosting them or not pissing them off for saying the wrong thing, or just, um, trying to like cheer them up. So I think there's like just benefit to be gained in so many places. So I think that with all that, then society will change, right? Like if we can really like sort of start something, right? Like, I don't know if it's called a movement, but just like pass the word along. Like, if we can all be a bit more willing to be in the dark, I don't think our world's beyond changing. Like, I think this is the weirdest part of me, is like, I'm an optimist when it comes to changing the world. I'm like, "Oh, I just want to do that. I'll just do that." I don't think that the world is so fixed that we can't educate. My whole life is dedicated to educating, right? I believe in it. I believe that if you like can put things in a reasonable way that makes sense, that tap into their experience, like, "Oh yeah, I can do that. Maybe I messed up." When I teach this class on dark moods, there's always students who are like, "Oh, I messed up because when my friend's mom died, I said this," and everyone messes up. We all mess up. We've all messed up. But the whole point is to be like, okay, now that we're like a little bit more literate and educated, like can we sit with them and not have it, not like resist the urge to just try to make them feel better in the moment, which probably won't work anyway.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and there's a sort of message I think that keeps coming through in lots of different ways throughout the book, and it really boils down to it's okay not to feel okay. And yeah, as somebody who's experiencing difficult feelings, that's in some ways a comfort, or at least a reassurance that you have permission not to feel okay. And then also from the point of view of how to relate from the outside to somebody in that position, there's nothing to do. It's just, yeah, I give you permission not to feel okay is really all we're going to say. And that might help in the first instance, at least. And it seemed to me there's one cultural example actually in the US, which other parts of the world might not be so familiar with, although perhaps a little more in recent years, because there was a documentary and a Hollywood movie about him, is Mr. Rogers. I wondered if you could
Mm.
say a little bit about who Mr. Rogers is and what he had to say on these subjects for those who don't know him.
I mean, he had a TV show for I think 30 years, more than 30 years, 1,000 episodes. When I was a kid, I thought he was really boring because Sesame Street was also on. But when I had kids, I went back and I watched him again because I remember it being slow, and I want all things slow for my kids. I want them not to be in this kind of crazy, frenetic world. I want patience and quiet and music and things to slow down. So I consider to him to be pretty Aristotelian. He's big into any feeling is okay. It's not the feeling that's the problem. You can, he says, anything that's mentionable is manageable. And so I've always taught my kids and showed them a lot of Mr. Rogers, like every feeling is okay. And he says a smile is good to wear when you feel like smiling, but a smile is not good to wear when you don't feel like smiling. You don't have to smile for people. You don't have to put on a false face. You can be who you are, and then other people will love you anyway, and should be able to love you anyway is the point, if we can sort of teach each other how to love each other and not sort of panic if someone's not smiling. So I just find him to be such a breath of fresh air in terms of being so like the caricatures of Mr. Rogers are that he's smiling, that he's always cheerful, that, like, but the movie that came out about him with Tom Hanks was actually quite good. I was afraid that it was going to be miss the mark, but it was really about anger and sadness and dark moods. And it was beautifully done because what Fred Rogers did was really try to get us to see that, again, like Aristotle, it's not the feeling that's the problem. It has to do with how you're expressing it. And if you're suppressing it, and then, or if you're taking it out on yourself or taking it out on other people, that all has to do with a society that will not allow us to express it. So if we don't let boys cry, we're going to have angry men, right? Like there's so many links between what we have in our society and the shaming that we do on little kids for showing their emotions. In girls, the case is anger. For boys, it tends to be crying. So it's like we're creating things that are unnatural because we're stifling feelings that are super normal and okay to feel because we're afraid that our kids feel them, or we don't want to admit that they're really normal to feel. So I really love Mr. Rogers, and I wish he was still here because I feel like we need a voice that is very talking to children specifically and very patient and kind and good and just like letting them know that they're okay exactly as they are. But I had wanted to say about one, I guess, maybe clarification on the only misinterpretation that I think could come of our conversation is that I'm saying like bad moods are good or something, or like, oh, there's gifts in your bad moods. That's not what I'm saying at all. So like, you were saying like you reserve the right to say that it's okay that you're not okay. And like, that's a great book by Megan Devine about grief. It's okay that you're not okay. And my sort of line that I go back to is like feeling bad about feeling bad. And so the normal feeling bad is like you have anxiety, right? That's the thing that you live with. And that I can't take away. I can't change that. Like there's that's bad and you can hate it, right? So I talk about all sorts of characters in the book who like hated their depression, they hated their anxiety. I have no problem with that. I don't think you have to say, well, this is the hidden gift of my depression. If you want to say that, that's okay too. You get to choose. But I don't need to say that it's a gift. We don't need to use that language. You can absolutely hate the mood, but what I'm trying to get rid of is the shame on top of it, the feeling bad about feeling bad, which is imposed on us by a society that expects us to have no bad days at all. And that panics when we have a bad day. And so that's the only part that I think I can have any influence on. So I'm not trying to change people's minds. Like it's not primarily a book about moods, it's a book about us. So even when me and my editor were going over the subtitle, it was like seeing dark moods in a better light. And I was like, no, that's not it. It's not about the dark moods. I'm not trying to make the dark moods good, right? I'm trying to say that we are good. We are whole. We are not broken. We are human. Like we get nauseous and we throw up and we suffer and we hold our mom's hand when she dies. Like we do that. That's us. That's what it means to be like a flesh and blood human being. And that's not wrong, right? So it's like seeing ourselves in the dark moods, not trying to like put like a weird positive spin on the dark mood itself. So just in
Yeah.
case.
No, thank you for clarifying. In fact, there's actually a really interesting double meaning in there because it's seeing ourselves through dark moods. So not only through the mood do you get to know yourself, but there's a way of sort of shepherding ourselves through these difficult experiences and perhaps out the other side. And it's not about the light at the end of the tunnel and running towards it as fast as possible and away from the feeling. It's just being with it. Another sort of catchphrase might be that the only way out is through. You can only by going into this properly is it possible to move beyond it. Otherwise, it's just repressed and it's going to come back to bite us.
Yeah, so that was my editor, Rob Tempio at Princeton. He was so proud of that subtitle. I was like, that's great. That's exactly what I wanted. It wasn't trying to just get out of it, right? It's like seeing ourselves, but also what you say is true. Like the only way out is through. I think of the example of crying. Like I have heard people say to me, if I start crying, I'll never stop. Right? So that gives you one philosophy, which is don't let it start. Like if I don't let it start, then I'm fine. But the other way is more like what I'm saying of like, I don't think that's ever happened ever in the history of people, that if you start crying, you just never stop. I think the actual crying can help you actually get through it. So there's this way in which I do think that being in the dark mood, and this is where it comes down to individuals and how much can you tolerate and how many people around you and how much support do you have. And issues of medicine and therapy, like lots of things, right? But I think that it's not necessarily the case that avoidance is the best way. I think it's like if we sit in it for a little bit and learn to adjust our eyes to be able to see it, to not turn on ourselves, to not be scared of it, etc., then I think we sometimes come through it faster than if we're fighting it, and then it's sort of like inside our body and also causing us other kinds of illness and things like that. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's a good subtitle. Yeah.
There's another dimension to that sort of aspect of things that I do want to just touch on quickly. And I suppose this comes from my own history of depression and wallowing to a certain extent. I know, that's a term that comes up with some sort of skepticism because, we can use this language to punish ourselves. But there is also a point at which a certain type of addictive, self-destructive tendency kicks in. And there is, absolute surrender to that process of spiraling ever further downwards. And I wonder then, where the line has to be drawn, where to strike a healthy balance between, opening to darkness, welcoming it, being with it, and at the same time not enabling it, not actually, giving an addict more of their chosen poison.
Yeah, I think that this is where the philosophical adage comes in, know thyself. Like I think that because I've had a lot of conversations with people about this topic, specifically about depression. It was the hardest chapter to write about because it's so dangerous.
Mm,
Um, Specifically about depression, like the knowing of the self and how much is helpful and how much is not helpful in terms of staying in the dark, and what kind of help do I have? What kind of tools? I think there was a book that came out in 1987 called Plato, Not Prozac, that philosophy should be able to be enough and it should help you and you don't need that medicine. And some people are anti-medicine and oh, that's weak. And I don't believe any of that. I just think the book could be Plato and Prozac, because whatever it is that we need to be able not just to run out of it and get out of it as fast as possible, but to know ourselves and to stay on our own side, right? So for me, the chapter on depression and my using Gloria Ansaldúa was to show that she couldn't get rid of it. She would get rid of it in a heartbeat if she could, right? These are just givens. And I think that's fine if that's how you feel. Anyone, like, you don't have to like it. But she couldn't get rid of it. So then what? What do you do since you're already in the situation, right? As a person who lives with depression, what do? You either, like I had a student who said, well, I'm perfect except I have depression, and that makes me broken. And I was like, okay, that's one way of talking about yourself. You're going to have to create a narrative about yourself that either takes your side or it doesn't take your side. So a lot of the words we use, like mental illness and sickness and disease, and a lot of these things don't help us feel good about ourselves. They make us feel broken. So then I'm like, okay, can we come up with, and societally, but also individually, like Ansaldúa came up with it. She didn't even use the word depression. She used the word the Coatlicue state, based on Aztec mythology about the Aztec goddess who would come and pull her under for weeks at a time. And I think that helped her develop her own narrative where, like, yes, I hate this thing that I live with, but I also live with it. So I don't want to throw myself in the garbage. I don't want to say that I'm poison or I'm a disease. Like, it's part of what I have to do. And so, or part of what I live with. And so it's like developing the narrative that keeps oneself on one's own side, that doesn't say, well, I'm great except this part and I'm going to throw away that. And I tell my students, like, well, then you're going to end up throwing away your whole self, right? Like, you can't just throw out that part. If you could, you would. But since you can't, what are you going to do? So in terms of like, how much can one handle inside the cave? I think that really just depends on the person. And I think that probably not someone, maybe except a therapist from the outside, could say, what's the amount of time? I don't know. Maybe it's a day, maybe it's an hour. Like, maybe it changes based on episode. I don't know. But like, from reading Andrew Solomon's book, which is amazing, called The Atlas of Depression, called The Noonday Demon, he was saying that at the very least, and he has like terrible episodes of depression, that for him talking about it is good, and that he used to be the sort of person who never talked about it, but that he was like learned from talking to all these like thousands of people that talking about it actually makes him feel less like crazy or less broken or less like just ill, you know. So I feel like there's something about that I like, that it's a medium, like no one has to just go in the cave and sit there forever just as homework or something like that, but it does have to do with maybe letting other people in, people you can trust, or like finding other people that a person can trust to be in the cave with you, or knowing yourself enough. But what I want to get rid of is the war with the self, the feeling that like I hate this thing, so therefore I hate myself. Like I'd rather sort of put a little bit more distance between those two things. So I don't happen to like the word wallowing, only because it's often used against other people, like against
Mm.
teenagers. Like, why are you wallowing, right? Like it has this like pity party, like it has a connotation that just sounds like, okay, you're already not taking their side. So it depends on how anyone uses it. I would like to hear an instance where it sounded friendly to me.
Mm.
But I think that might just be semantics, you know.
Well, I think you have a point. I mean, it's very difficult though, even from, I'm talking about my own experience, and thankfully it's not my, day-to-day reality these days. But there was a time when I did not know how to do anything other than just marinate in that way of being. And I did all sorts of things to make it more entrenched. And
Mhm.
that wasn't very helpful. And I guess that leads me to the last thing I'd really like to drill down into, which is this question of personal agency. And to a certain extent, the only way out of that hole for me involved me having to actually do some of the things that have come in for a bit of a bad rap in our conversation. A bit of pulling myself up by the bootstraps, taking responsibility, choosing to, perhaps in the language of the Serenity Prayer, make the distinctions between the things I could control, the things I couldn't, and find some courage to change the things that were within my power, and also to accept that the other stuff wasn't going to be changeable. And I wonder if there is a danger as well with the emphasis on needing to listen to the moods and needing to sort of neutralize this shaming message of it's all on you, that that might get lost. That sense that we are actually autonomous beings, and although we can overspin that into some sort of neoliberal nightmare, there is still the reality that taking responsibility for oneself is a power that is available to us.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really like it's like a fascinating question because it's ongoing. Like I've read a book recently about a man who was an alcoholic, and he swears that he needed to shame himself to get out of alcoholism.
Mm,
And I can't argue with that because he says that's what he needed, right? But all I see is self-hatred there. Like
mm,
I don't think that would work for me to hate myself so much to kick my own butt to get out of something. Like it seems to me that there's also another way. So maybe what we could distinguish between is like a self-hatred way of getting out of it and like a self-loving way to get out of it. Like I don't think the dichotomy is between wallow and marinate and do nothing in the dark. Like that's certainly what I'm not advocating for,
mm,
versus, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Like maybe it's the language that's like getting in the way. Cause I have more of like a feeling of like, am I on my own side? Are we in this together? You and me, like me and me, are we in it together? And do we want help? And are we trying to get out of it with self-love? Like, I don't think that self-love equals self-indulgence equals stay in bed all the time. There is, but I also don't think it has to be a place coming from this bouncer or like, trainer who's going to like beat you up if you don't get out of bed either. Like it's almost, and it might just be dispositional, right? Because if this guy that I'm talking about, if he really needed that, like, okay, I get it. Like not everyone lives in the world that I experience, but for me, that kind of self-hatred and pulling against myself would actually make it harder for me to get up out of bed. It would make it easier if I could love myself, and it kind of more in the Mr. Rogers vein of like, I am okay the way that I am, and I also want help because I don't want to be in this anymore. So maybe it's for me, it rubs more on the how do I feel about myself? What's the story I'm telling about myself that I tell to other people? Like, what's my self narrative? Is it baked in a kind of self-love and self-acceptance that also requires a lot of agency out of me and a lot of possibility and a lot of feeling that I can change my world, Or is it based on, and it could even be the way that we're raised. I mean, not individually, you and me, but just like societally, like or is our philosophy based on like you have to like tough love, the way that tough love sort of manifests itself, like the kind of trainer that would like scream at you. Like I wouldn't do well if a trainer was sort of screaming at me to do more push-ups. Like I think I would do worse. So I don't know if it's a matter of words or a matter of disposition or just a matter of different personalities. Like I could be any.
I think you touched there on the most important point. There's an enormous range of,
Mhm.
diversity of character types, life experiences, cultural milieus, and there isn't one size fits all solution to
Yeah.
any of this, really, apart from, I do think there is a lot of merit to what you're saying about, not trying to divide the self into, warring factions. That's a recipe for making things worse. But as you say, some people might well find that's the thing that scares them out of the whole.
Mhm.
And yeah, in the 12-step context, the first thing you do is admit your own powerlessness. So you say, I've actually not got what it takes in order to be able to, give yourself over to the program. So there's lots of different ways of going about it. And that leads me to wonder whether the ultimate synthesis here is beyond light and dark and beyond this metaphor of whether we go from one to the other or one's better than the other, and whether there's something sort of between light and dark, or infused by light and dark. And obviously in the real world, between white and black, there's a whole spectrum of
Yes.
color. And I
Yes.
wonder what that might look like in the future if your sort of prognostications of what the book might inspire were to manifest, to use that word.
Or just what other people take up, right? But yes,
Yeah.
I want a world full of colors. Like I only used this metaphor because it's the metaphor that people already use. Like we're already like I can't jump ahead to a world of color without trying to like show how the black and white has been weaponized, I guess, against people, against moods, against a lot of things. And so, but my hope is that it becomes obsolete. My hope is that the world doesn't remain as it is, and that we actually like grow out of just talking about things in terms of light and dark, and that, like when I'm sad, I don't say, I'm broken or something's wrong with me or I don't know what's wrong with me. I just say I'm sad, right? Like I would like to be more precise with language and just kind of be specific about what the feelings are, especially getting more specific with anger, and that we accept each other's feelings more so that we don't panic. There's another story from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was writing about a parent, so a couple who had a daughter, and they were on the phone with her, and the daughter had just lost her husband. And the daughter started crying, talking to her parents, and the mother said, okay, I'm just going to let you go, because the mother wanted to respect the daughter's privacy and desire to grieve. And then the dad said, well, I'm just going to stay on the phone and you can cry all you like. Right. So it shows like everything. They both love the daughter, right? They have these different upbringings, these different ideas about what's good and privacy and all this kind of thing. And I don't know, weakness or something. I've seen it a lot with football players. Like there was a video where like the son was crying, a big football player, and the mom put like cloth over his head so no one would see him crying, and everyone was applauding, saying, what a great mom. She's like helping her son not be ashamed. Like there's so much out there of what we think is the right thing to do. But I guess just to come back to your point, like I feel like colors and just accepting people's moods and not being so panicked by them and not expecting everyone to just have a great day. Like maybe we just stop saying, how are you? And just say, it's good to see you. It's nice to see you. And not have the expectations of you should be good. How was your summer? Like we're getting a lot of that as academics. How was your summer? And you have to kind of sum it all up in one word and it's terrible. So just accepting more of the range of people for all different kinds and not then worrying about them or not then having to like, um, ask more about it necessarily if they don't want to talk about it, but just, yeah, it's pretty normal. Like lowering the standards. Like I want to see the shirts that say half bad days or something like that, right? The signs that are just more realistic and more true to like just who we are as humans who have light and dark and all the colors inside of us. Like it is more of a kind of Mr. Rogers spirit. We're not inviting it, but the point is it already happens, right? Suffering already happens. We're not trying to get more of it. We're just trying to like not deny the parts that are already there that can be used to draw us closer together and give us more self-knowledge.
Thank you. One last question. What are you working on next? Obviously, you're fully engaged as a teaching academic, but and I think as an activist as well. But I wonder, from the point of view of more books, given that this one was so accessibly written and engaging, if we might have another one to look forward to.
Yeah, I've just started writing another book, and it's going to be on shame.
Mm.
So, so I'm just trying to drill down into that particular phenomenon and trying to show what's going on there and how are the ways that we're talking about it like a little bit limiting for the actual experience of it.
Super.
So we'll
Well,
see how it goes.
look forward to it.
Okay.
A topic I was going to say close to my heart, but that's the wrong way of putting it. One with which I'm intimately familiar would probably be more accurate.
Yes. Yes, 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 yes.
Well, thank you, Mariana. It's been a great pleasure to speak, and thank you again for the book. If anyone's listening and is curious, get yourself a copy. It's out now in paperback. And thanks once again.
Thank you so much for talking to me. It was a really nice conversation to be able to get into all the different aspects of it. Thank you.
Welcome.